War teaches men to expect the worst first. For mercenaries, that usually meant iron on the wrists, a locked door, and silence about what came next. 1369, along a disputed road between Amiens and Abbeville in Picardy, that expectation mattered because the Hundred Years' War had entered a phase where small forces vanished without notice, and survival depended less on honor than on accounting. The men taken that day were not defeated in a great battle. There were no trumpets or banners lowered. It was a short, sharp encounter on a road used to move grain and timber toward the Somme. The kind of clash that left a few bodies in the mud and then disappeared from memory. No chronicler followed them. No Lord's seal protected them. They were mercenaries, hired by contract, paid by the month when money arrived on time, and dismissed just as easily when it did not. Some had armor bought second-hand. Some carried weapons older than themselves. A few had worked as masons or carters before war offered better pay. None wore colors that demanded negotiation. When the fight ended, their captors did what was expected. Weapons were taken, belts were cut away, names were not asked for, because names mattered less than value. A man with a title could be priced. A man without one had to prove he was worth feeding. The road itself explains much of what followed. This was not a castle courtyard with space for dungeons and guards. It was contested land, raided often enough that fields were thin and stores uncertain. Every extra mouth mattered. Holding prisoners was never free. Grain had to be milled. Bread had to be baked. Men had to stand watch instead of working fields or repairing defenses. That is why the first surprise came early. After the search, instead of ropes and wagons, questions followed. Simple ones. Who knew stonework? Who had handled carts? Who could mend a wheel or cut timber straight? The answers were not taken on trust, but they were noted. This was not mercy. It was calculation. In this part of France, garrisons rose and fell with supply lines. Roads washed out. Mills broke. Palisades burned during raids and had to be rebuilt before the next one came. Labor kept men alive as surely as steel. Mercenaries understood this logic better than most. Their lives were already measured in days of service and coin paid out at sunset. Still, the moment unsettled them. Captivity had rules they knew. This offered a different bargain, one that blurred the line between prisoner and worker. They were marched not to a cell but to a holding yard near the road. Food came that evening, thin but warm. No chains were fitted. Guards stayed close. The message was clear enough without being spoken. Run, and you would be hunted. Stay, and you might be useful. Usefulness mattered because ransom culture ran on reputation as much as force. Men who killed prisoners without cause earned a name that followed them. Men who treated captives in a way that made future surrender possible gained a quieter advantage. Even mercenaries paid attention to this. Roads carried stories as well as goods. The absence of banners cut both ways. Without a lord to claim them, these men had little leverage. Yet without a powerful enemy watching, their captors had room to choose how to proceed. Chains were one option. Work was another. That first night, the mercenaries talked in low voices. Some expected a trick. Others recognized the situation for what it was. They had been caught at a moment when labor was more valuable than revenge. That fact alone kept them alive. They slept on the ground with their boots close, guarded but not bound. In the dark, the sounds of carts and distant watermills carried across the fields. The war was still there, moving slowly around them, indifferent to how they would survive it. But the absence of chains did not mean safety, and the offer made the next morning would turn captivity into something more demanding than a locked door. By the second day, the logic behind the offer became harder to ignore. War did not pause to accommodate prisoners, and this part of Picardy had little patience for excess mouths. A garrison on contested ground lived close to shortage even in good seasons. Grain came in carts that might not arrive. Mills failed when wheels cracked or races filled with silt. Roads mattered because roads fed soldiers. Every problem multiplied when fighting returned, and fighting always returned. In that setting, keeping captives idle was not just inconvenient. It was costly. A prisoner had to eat. He had to be watched. If he fell ill, he became a problem rather than a person. Guards assigned to watch him were guards, not repairing walls or escorting supplies. Iron had to be forged and maintained. Space had to be secured. None of this came cheap. Lords and captains understood this well. The idea that prisoners were simply locked away misunderstands how war functioned on the ground. Captivity was a temporary state, while value was assessed. For nobles, that value was expressed in ransoms, negotiated through letters and intermediaries. For ordinary soldiers, value was less certain and more flexible. Mercenaries sat awkwardly between categories. They were trained, disciplined, and often skilled with tools as well as weapons, but they lacked the family networks that made ransom reliable. Holding them indefinitely was a gamble few could afford. This was why work entered the picture so quickly. The offer did not promise freedom, it promised usefulness. Each man who worked reduced the burden he represented. Each repaired structure strengthened the position holding him. It was a transaction stripped of ceremony. The captors made their terms clear. Food and shelter would be provided. Wages would be counted, not paid out immediately. Deductions would be made for bread, stew, and the guards assigned to oversee them. Order would be enforced. Disobedience would end the arrangement. This was not a contract between equals. Refusal meant confinement, and confinement meant uncertainty. But acceptance placed the prisoners inside a system they understood. Time would be measured in days worked rather than days waited. For the men taken on the road, this calculation cut deep. They knew that medieval war rewarded pragmatism more often than courage. They had seen villages spared because they could pay, and burned because they could not. They had repaired walls before, sometimes for the same lords now holding them. What surprised them was not the demand for labor, but the structure around it. Tasks were assigned with purpose. One group cleared a drainage ditch that had flooded the road the previous winter. Another worked under a millwright to reset a wheel whose broken paddles had slowed grain processing for weeks. Timber was cut and stacked properly, not hacked apart in haste. This organization revealed something important. The men holding them were not improvising. They had done this before. Captives were folded into the local economy, not as free workers, but as temporary assets whose output mattered. Accounting followed the work. Names were written down. Days were tallied. A clerk marked what each man had eaten and what he had earned. This paperwork was not kindness. It was protection for the captors. If questions came later, records would speak. Reputation shaped these choices. In regions where armies passed repeatedly, tomorrow's prisoner could be yesterday's guard. Treating captives in a way that kept surrender possible, reduced bloodshed later. Men who believed they would be killed fought harder. Men who believed they might work and live sometimes chose differently. The mercenaries noticed this too. Survival was no longer about endurance alone. It depended on appearing reliable, capable, and worth keeping alive. The workday became a test as real as any skirmish. They were still prisoners. They slept under watch. Movement was controlled. Yet each day of labor shifted their status slightly, away from expendable bodies and toward something harder to discard. Yet economics does not soften captivity, and the work itself would force the men to confront what it meant to rebuild the very world their fighting had helped break. The work began without ceremony. No speeches were given, and no promises were repeated. At first light, the men were divided, tools were handed out, and guards took their places where they could see hands as clearly as faces. The tasks chosen were not accidental. Each one answered a problem the war had created and left unresolved. A road cut by wagon ruts and winter rain had to be made passable again. A palisade scorched during a raid needed fresh timber before the next attack tested it. The mill that fed both soldiers and nearby villagers had to turn again, or nothing else would function properly. For the mercenaries, this work carried a particular weight. They recognized it immediately. These were the same structures they had targeted in other campaigns. Roads slowed armies when broken. Mills starved garrisons when disabled. Palisades bought time. Now they were repairing what they once ruined. The labor was controlled, but not brutal. Tools were counted out in the morning and counted back at night. Guards stayed close, but did not strike unless order broke down. The message was steady and unspoken. You are not being punished. You are being used. This distinction mattered. Medieval societies drew a clear line between enslavement and compelled labor. Slavery still existed in parts of the Mediterranean world, but in northern France it was rare and legally constrained. These men were not property. They were captives under obligation, bound by circumstance rather than chains. That difference shaped how they were treated. They were expected to work competently, not endlessly. Injured men were reassigned rather than discarded. A man who knew stonework was placed with a mason. Someone familiar with carts was sent to manage loads rather than haul them blindly. This use of skill was practical, not humane. A broken mill repaired poorly wasted time and material. A ditch dug without understanding drainage would flood again. Competence mattered because failure carried consequences for everyone. The mercenaries adapted quickly. Many had come to war from trades that never fully left them. A man who once built walls did not forget how stone settled. Another who had driven wagons before taking up arms still knew how to balance weight and pace. War had not erased these skills, it had merely delayed their use. Days settled into a rhythm. Work at first light. A pause at midday. More work until the light softened. Food followed, plain but sufficient. Bread, broth, sometimes a piece of salted meat. Enough to keep strength, never enough to forget dependence. The guards learned to read the men as the men learned to read the guards. Tension eased without disappearing. Escapes were discussed quietly and dismissed just as quietly. The roads were watched. The surrounding countryside was thin and unfamiliar. Running promised hunger before freedom. What changed most was how time felt. Prisoners waiting for ransom lived in suspension, measuring days by rumor and hope. These men measured time by effort. Each task finished became a marker. Each week worked added weight to the quiet calculation that governed their fate. Work also altered how they were seen. A man repairing a wheel became part of the system that fed others. A group clearing a road became essential to supply. Their presence shifted from threat to function. That did not make them trusted, but it made them necessary. Necessity has its own power. Men who are needed are harder to discard. The mercenaries understood this instinctively. They worked carefully. They avoided conflict. They let their usefulness speak. At night, talk turned less to escape and more to numbers. How much had been earned, how much deducted, how long this might last. Freedom remained distant, but it was no longer abstract. It had a pace. Still, labor alone did not decide their future, because wages, records, and reputation would determine whether work led anywhere at all. The counting mattered as much as the work itself. Every evening after tools were returned and the men were fed, a clerk sat with a board and chalk and made marks that would decide more than any guard's mood. Medieval war ran on records more than it liked to admit. Pay lists, supply tallies, and letters of obligation kept armies moving long after enthusiasm faded. Captivity entered this same world of numbers. A prisoner who could be counted could be valued. A prisoner without a record was simply a risk. The mercenaries learned quickly that nothing was casual. Days worked were noted. Tasks were described. Food was deducted. If a man was sick and reassigned, that too was written down. The wages promised were modest, but they were consistent. Not coin placed in hand, but credit set aside against future release. This method protected both sides. For the captors, it proved that the men were being maintained, not abused or hidden. If questions came from a superior lord, or from another force passing through, the ledger offered an answer. These men were working off their captivity. They were accounted for. For the prisoners, the record was the only shield they had. Words could be denied. Marks on a board could not. Each tally meant another step away from indefinite detention. Each week completed meant they were less likely to vanish into a forgotten corner of the war. Reputation entered quietly but firmly. Medieval armies were smaller than they appeared, and news moved fast along military routes. How captives were treated shaped how future enemies behaved. A captain known for killing prisoners invited resistance. One known for keeping agreements invited surrender. This did not make war gentle, it made it predictable. Predictability saved lives. The mercenaries understood this logic better than most. Their own survival often depended on being seen as reliable partners, even in defeat. A man who kept order, worked steadily, and did not cause trouble strengthened the captor's reputation as much as his own. Some captors watched closely. They noticed who worked without complaint and who tried to damage tools or slow progress. They noted who respected boundaries and who tested them. These observations entered memory, even if they never reached the ledger. Wages were adjusted quietly. A skilled mason earned more credit than a general laborer. A man trusted to work closer to the palisade earned more than one kept under constant watch. This was not generosity. It was incentive. In a world where formal prisons were rare and long-term detention impractical, these small distinctions mattered. They shaped who was released first, who might be paroled under condition, and who would be kept until the very end. Letters played a role as well. Some mercenaries wrote home, not to demand ransom, but to signal survival. A family that knew a man lived might gather coin. A former employer might intervene if the price was reasonable. The ledger supported these claims. This man has worked. This man has value. The captors benefited too. If the war shifted and they themselves were taken later, their past treatment of prisoners might return as mercy. No one said this aloud, but everyone understood it. Over time, the men began to see that captivity was no longer a single event. It was a process shaped by behavior, labor, and memory. A bad day could erase weeks of progress. A steady one added weight to their claim for release. They were still watched, they were still dependent, but they were no longer invisible. In a war that swallowed men without trace, being recorded was a form of survival. Yet even with wages counted and reputations forming, daily life remained suspended between freedom and restraint, a condition that reshaped how these men understood themselves. After the novelty of work wore off, what remained was the space in between. Not imprisonment as the men had known it, and not freedom in any meaningful sense. Something narrower, more controlled, and harder to describe. The days settled into repetition. Wake at first light, eat what was given, work under watch, return tools, eat again, sleep where told. No cell door closed behind them, yet no step was taken without permission. This absence of clear boundaries proved more tiring than chains. Men accustomed to movement found stillness unsettling. Mercenaries lived by marching, fighting, and leaving. Captivity forced them to remain in one place long enough to notice details. The way, the mill race, filled with silt after rain, the uneven stones in the road that broke cart axles, the quiet calculation in the eyes of the guards who depended on the same bread. Food became a measure of trust. Portions were consistent. No feast, no starvation. Enough to keep men working, never enough to forget control. A guard who stole from the pot risked punishment as surely as a prisoner who caused trouble. Order depended on fairness, not kindness. Discipline followed the same rule. Punishments were swift and limited. Extra watch, loss of earned credit, removal from skilled work to hauling. The goal was correction, not spectacle. Violence disrupted productivity, and productivity was the point. The mercenaries changed in small ways. Their weapons were gone, and with them much of their authority. Skill replaced force. A man who knew how to true a wheel or align a wall held influence that no sword could provide. Respect shifted quietly. Talk at night reflected this shift. Plans of escape gave way to calculations about release. Who might be freed first? How much credit remained? Whether winter would delay everything. War outside continued, but inside the holding yard, time moved at a different pace. Some men struggled with the moral weight of their labor. Repairing roads helped armies move. Strengthening palisades protected soldiers they once fought. The work blurred lines they preferred to keep sharp. Yet hunger had a way of clarifying priorities. Survival came before purity. Others found the work grounding. War was chaos. This had rules. Effort produced visible results. A repaired mill turned. A cleared road held. These outcomes mattered to people who depended on them, even if those people wore different colors. The guards noticed this too. Tension eased without disappearing. Jokes were rare, but not forbidden. Names were learned. Boundaries remained firm, but the distance between captor and captive narrowed just enough to function. This closeness carried risk. Too much familiarity invited resentment from both sides. Captors had to remember authority. Captives had to remember their place. The balance required constant attention. Illness tested it. When a man fell sick, he was isolated but not abandoned. If he recovered, work resumed. If he did not, his credit stopped. Death was accounted for quietly, not dramatized. War left little room for mourning. The longer this state continued, the harder it became to imagine returning to the old life unchanged. Mercenaries were defined by movement and choice, however limited. Here, choice existed only within narrow bounds. Accept it and live. Resist it and suffer. This condition taught a lesson few expected. Freedom was not a single moment, but a process shaped by trust and usefulness. The men learned to endure not by waiting, but by fitting themselves into the machinery that held them. Still, no captivity lasts forever, and the question of release would force both sides to decide what these men were truly worth. Release did not arrive with ceremony. There was no announcement, no crowd gathered to witness it. Freedom, when it came, did so quietly, as if it were another entry in the ledger. By late autumn of 1369, the situation along the road had shifted. Supplies moved more reliably. The mill turned without interruption. The palisade stood repaired, its fresh timber already weathering. The immediate need that had justified holding the mercenaries had eased. Keeping them now meant feeding them through winter. The calculations changed. One by one, names were called. A clerk checked the marks beside them. Credits were totaled. Deductions were confirmed. What remained was not a reward, but a threshold. Enough had been worked. Enough had been paid for. Release came with conditions. The men were escorted to the edge of controlled land and sent on without weapons. Some received a small sum of coin. What remained after costs were settled. Others left with nothing but their lives. None were thanked. This was not generosity. It was closure. For the captors, holding men longer than necessary carried risk. Prisoners could become resentful. Guards could grow careless. Resources would tighten as winter approached. Releasing captives who had proven manageable removed a burden without creating an enemy eager for revenge. These men had been treated according to an understood logic. That mattered. For the mercenaries, freedom felt altered. They returned to roads they knew, but with fewer illusions. War had not punished them or redeemed them. It had used them, even in defeat. Some sought new contracts quickly. Skills dulled if unused. Others avoided the road for a time, working instead as laborers or carters, trades they had been forced to remember. A few carried the lesson longer than expected. They chose their employers more carefully. They watched supply lines as closely as battle lines. What stayed with them was not gratitude, but clarity. They had learned that survival in medieval war depended less on bravery than on value. A man who could be fed cheaply, guarded easily, and put to work had a chance. A man who offered nothing but resistance did not. This episode was not unique. Across late medieval Europe, similar arrangements appeared wherever war outpaced resources. Captivity adapted to circumstance. When ransoms failed, labor replaced them. When labor no longer paid, release followed. The moral is not that war was humane, it was that war was practical. Mercenaries, often dismissed as rootless and reckless, understood this better than most. Their lives were already transactional. This experience stripped away the last layer of pretense. Loyalty was temporary. Violence was conditional. Survival belonged to those who could make themselves useful under pressure. For historians, these moments matter because they reveal how medieval society functioned beyond ideals of honor and cruelty. Power expressed itself through logistics, food, records, and timing. Control came not only from force, but from the ability to manage people efficiently. For viewers, the lesson is quieter, but still present. Systems shape behavior more than intentions. When survival depends on contribution, usefulness becomes a form of leverage. Even in captivity, agency survives in narrow, practical choices. This story asks the viewer to reconsider what strength looked like in the medieval world. Not defiance, not martyrdom, but endurance guided by clear-eyed understanding of how power actually worked. If this account changed how you imagine medieval warfare and captivity, share it with someone who still sees the past only in terms of battles and heroes. Stories like this survive because they are passed on, not because they are celebrated.